The ideas that gave birth to our nation are the ideas that our nation is resistant to right now, and we should talk about that all the time.
In a world where narratives are shaped by corporations and gatekeepers, independent voices matter more than ever. Badlands Media brings together citizen journalists, researchers, and independent thinkers.
The truth is triggering.
Question the narrative. Explore the facts.
Its authenticity, courage, resilience.
Search for the truth others won't.
It's not about being first or being right.
The information war is changing.
It's about being authentic.
Embrace the friction.
Embrace the friction.
Shut the f*** up.
Authentically antagonizing. Join the movement.
I'm going to say how I feel.
Follow Badlands Media.
This is about the future.
The Badlands. What are the Badlands? Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
All right, welcome everybody to this week's episode of Breaking Free of Psyops. That's actually the first time that I've seen the new introduction, and it's cool. It's very cool, but I look pretty miserable walking through the rain. That's okay though. That's okay. I would still wear an umbrella if that were really me, and that's going to be the best way to identify as a clue for anybody watching. If they're wondering, hey, are they watching a deep fake of Matthew online? If they see me walking around under some form of rainy situation, the answer is yes, if I'm not wearing an umbrella. Okay, but very cool introduction otherwise. Welcome everybody. We are going to be going through a topic which I believe is extremely strategic at this very moment. I mean, that's redundant in some ways because I made this show in order to present topics that I think are all very strategic at this very moment, but this one especially. And I think this is one of the most overlooked stories that gave rise to our current predicaments and the current confusion that a lot of people have in our current society, resulting in many people susceptible to types of narratives, types of garbage lies about who we're told to think of as our enemy, who to hate and fear. A lot of the people who should know better are quite susceptible to very unproven, just outright lies that are spun to them from a wide array of sources, even in the alternative media space, which often have the hands of the Five Eyes and intelligence operations behind them. So I'm referring today to the Cold War. And the Cold War itself is something which definitely happened, but not for the reasons you think. And the infiltration, the foreign powers that infiltrated our world, as we will come to see, had less to do with Russia or with China and much more to do with the city of London and an old hereditary power structure of Europe that gave rise to the Crusades 1,000 years ago, and that have a lot more to do with the people that we were introduced to in this first episode 2 weeks ago around the figure of Aleister Crowley and the entire Rosicrucian occult nexus, which is sort of the religious inner core of this oligarchy that's been transmitting itself since ancient times into our presently precarious world. So that did happen. There was this foreign infiltration, but again, and it did take on a lot of the, it was responsible throughout the Cold War for the accusations of a globalist conspiracy. But like I said, a limited hangout is what we're looking at. Is the way you get a lie isn't just by completely telling a total lie. It's even by embracing a lot of truth, but then infusing some Trojan horses into your truthful narratives that then deflect people away from who is really the arsonist burning your village down. And while you're busy beating up some other person in another village who you've been told is the cause of these nefarious things that are destroying the lives of your neighbors and your family, it's actually the real arsonist who is telling you that the whole time, who's been in your village, who's still laughing at you. So without further ado, let's get on with the show. Now, I prepared, as usually is the case when I do these things solo, and is a little slideshow. And I chose to call this the lie that launched the Cold War, the Guzenko Affair hoax of 1946. Before actually I even go into the story, there's one other point I want people to hold in mind right now. Speaking to you all from Canada, there is absolutely right now a major acceleration to create things like national security courts in Canada. That's something that has been advanced for a couple of years, and it is going into its final phase of activation outside of the awareness of many people. However, for those who do know about it, either you work in the deep state or you might be a reader of certain literature. Canadians might be familiar with people like Sam Cooper, who's a major figure, used to write for the Globe and Mail, and who has been making pretty much his entire shtick these days around making everything bad in the world appear to be China's fault. That everything we have as our problems is all explainable by China. The evil Chinese are out to get us. One of the things he's positively promoting throughout his writings and many of his presentations that he gives prolifically online, he's got a big following in Canada. I don't know if many Americans know of him, is the idea that we need to embrace secret courts, secret national security courts to keep us safe. There's certain laws that he's also promoting. They're receiving the support of many duped followers who believe that he's actually a patriot, along with the intelligence agencies that provide him all sorts of information that he uses in his narratives. And so many of these patriots who should know better are actually still saying, yes, we do need this as well to protect us from the Chinese, because the Chinese are apparently the only things that are going to be targeted by these secret national security courts that will not need to bring up any evidence publicly or even to those who have been accused of some crime or another. There's the Stinchcombe Act, which is a national protection act, as something which protects anybody who is under investigation, who has been accused by the state of some form of misdemeanor, some form of ill act. Their lawyers have to be allowed to see what is this evidence that is being used by the accusers, so that they could formulate some form of counter argument or even just debunk it to say, no, that's fake. That if people like Sam Cooper and whoever he is who's he's working with happen to get their way, then that's going to be gone. He's championing the removal of that, with the idea that, oh, every time we've allowed lawyers to see the information of phone numbers that we're tracing of Chinese triads or drug gangs, they immediately change the phone numbers and get burner phones or get a new phone number to carry out their same crimes, ignoring the fact that the entire narco drug complex is actually been managed and has been since even before the Cold War began, top down by those same City of London banks that created the opium war, that run HSBC, that run the big Canadian and many of the US financial institutions, ignoring all of that. So they'll use this small example and then ignore that, no, you're allowing in now total secrecy, total secret evidence in secret courts. And it's getting very Orwellian as this is done. So don't think that if this is permitted in, that this is only going to be used against people who are accused of promoting a Russian or Chinese agenda. This is going to spread widely to anybody who is considered disruptive to the interests of the transhumanist technate running this shit show. Forgive the language. So just to say, now we'll get back on the story of the lie that launched the Cold War. Now, what is this Gouzenko Affair hoax of 1946 that I speak of? We're going to get to know a lot about that, and you as people in America and even in Canada where this happened might be blown away by its importance in changing our history in a very bad direction. Oops. All right. So the first thing here I want to just play is a speech that unleashed the Cold War publicly, although, as we'll come to see, this was just the icing on the cake of something that had been building up for many months before that. Here's Winston Churchill in Missouri announcing that a new policy of the Iron Curtain is going to be defining the next several generations of humanity.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie...
Just want to make sure that people can actually hear what he's saying. I believe that they can. Stop screen. Let's actually make sure. I just want to be doubly sure that everyone can hear what he was saying. Yes, people could hear that.
Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. And all our subjects, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from.
Okay, I've just been told by somebody who's just texted me that his British accent and the low quality recording are very difficult to hear online. And so basically what you're hearing, though, is the Prime Minister of England coming to the United States, telling the United States what it is going to be expected to do and what its new foreign policy priorities will be going forward. This is not an American initiative, contrary to much popular belief. But what was he exactly, what was going on? What was the environment, the contour? Well, the problem was that those agencies that had given rise to eugenics, which is at the heart of what became later on transhumanism, they never went away. They were never properly punished. It wasn't just that eugenics was particularly some German science or German perverse project from the Nazi Reich. It was practice. It was embraced extremely enthusiastically by Nazi Germany, of course, but its origins were not German, and it was not uniquely found in Germany either. It was practiced. It was taught in universities from Harvard as a science of genetic hygiene, racial hygiene, this idea of using mathematics, statistics in order to predict preventatively predict likely possibilities or probabilities of somebody's children being born with mental incapacities or tendencies even to immorality or tendencies to poverty. These were things that were actually taught in universities that were bankrolled by things like the Rockefeller Foundation, like the Carnegie Foundation, like the Josiah Macy Institute or the Josiah Macy Foundation, and which originated actually in Great Britain through things like the X Club of the Royal Society, which also had been the directing force behind the creation of Charles Darwin, through people like Thomas Huxley, his bulldog, a major promoter of eugenics, or people like Herbert Spencer, who promoted social Darwinism, or Galton, Darwin's cousin, who was also, they were both members of this Royal Society X Club. Galton being the creator of what we today called eugenics as a centralized science of managing human evolution by the most fit to eliminate the unfit, right? Or then to even positively create new types of humans that could be bred in the same way that we breed racing dogs or guard dogs that wouldn't exist naturally by themselves in nature, where there are only wolves, or prairie dogs, but rather that this could be extended now to human logic in the human domain, in this law of the jungle. So this was sick, and it was applied, it became law in 30 US states from 1907 in Indiana, where it was first applied as the first US state to practice eugenics, under the sponsorship and enthusiastic sponsorship of people like Teddy Roosevelt, a rabid promoter of eugenics and a racist, and then spread to 30 other US states going forward until 1933. Additionally, 2 Canadian provinces had applied eugenics laws, forced sterilization laws, Alberta and British Columbia, in the 1920s and 30s as well. And these were used as models for what was then brought into Germany in the 30s with Hitler's attainment of power through his own false flag. So that is the burning of the Reichstag and his proclamation that I will restore order out of this chaos if we just give up our idea of having any democratic inclinations and let me become the Führer, let me become the new emperor of a new 1,000-year Reich. But he didn't say that out loud. He said it'll just be a temporary emperorship, and I'll give it back and step back once I put out the fires of the communists and Jews that are controlling our banks and that burnt down our parliament building. Now, it was discovered in hindsight that that was actually Hitler's own SS officers working through the Annenelbe that had carried out this false flag event, but the effects worked. Hitler got what he wanted, and the Rockefeller Foundation continued with Josiah Macy to sponsor eugenics in the new Nazi Germany, which enthusiastically embraced it. So what you have here are not just some promotional posters, propaganda posters teaching Germans why they need to think about the money that it costs to keep every retarded person like that featured there on that image on the left. I'm sorry, I know that's not politically correct, but I don't remember even what the proper word is at this point, so I'll just say what it is. They're retarded in their development to be a natural human being with full capacities that has been retarded by some things out of their control. Point being is it takes money by the state, by taxpayers, to support such people. Whereas they would say, and on the image on the right, you know, this vagabond, this person who's probably a ne'er-do-well, and this other person who's probably a thief, they probably inherited those traits from ne'er-do-well grandparents, ignoring completely the unjust economic architecture that might be incentivizing bad activities or closing the door on opportunities for young people in creating more impoverishment that might result in more bad behavior, more criminality. Ignoring all of that, it's probably just genetic, they say. And look at this proper Aryan worker who has to support two of these eaters, these useless eaters, on his back. Or in the middle is an English version that was promoted across the United States. Only the healthy seed must be sown, promoting only the idea that we could only permit proper, fit people to breed and not the unfit. So let's look a little bit more about, okay, so everyone has seen these guys, Franco, Spanish fascist Franco, and Hitler. This is going to come up in the story a little bit more, especially Franco's fascist Spain that attained power in 37, 38 after a civil war that went on between the Republicans versus the fascists. Many of the Republicans found allies from the Russian side as well that came in as communists, but they were working together to fight fascism. After all, communism, the communist state of Russia, of the Soviet Union back then, did, after all, take on something like 90% of the weight carrying World War II. That was 25 million Russians died by the end of World War II, and 89% or 90% of the German Wehrmacht was put into Russia that they had to defeat. We had it easy in the West. We had a lot of sacrifice, a lot of noble, honorable sacrifices that men had made in that war, but comparable to the sacrifices of the Chinese, of the Russians, and also the Chinese, who had 9 million of their people die in their battle against Japanese fascism, both fascisms being supported by the same bankers that we might go through in more detail in a future episode. So Franco was not an exception to this. Now, Franco did remain neutral in the war, which is why these fascists continued much more powerfully after the war than they did in an outward form in Germany or in Italy. But very important that that was happening. Also, you had fascism in countries we don't even think of as being necessarily fascist, like, for example, the vast movement of Sir Oswald Mosley, who had direct ties to Aleister Crowley and the high British imperial network as well, that had ties into Germany before and during World War II. And that's he was a parliamentarian, an elite from a high hereditary family in England, who was also a practitioner of theosophy, and somebody also who was tied to the Fabians, of all things, so a nominally left-wing socialist brand of technocracy that he was, as a right-wing hardcore nationalist, or so he was called, or wanted himself to be called, was actually affiliated with this thing too. So you had Oswald Mosley, who would have been the British Hitler had he attained power as he desired, and had Germany been successful in their many, many different accolades to their sponsors in England to have a peace treaty with Germany and simply cooperate as had been promised in the 1930s earlier to co-manage the New World Order together. And people like Oswald Mosley clearly wanted that. Other ones thought that that was too much sacrifice and that Hitler had become a little bit too powerful and a little bit too off the rails. Not that people like Churchill were not fascist. He did actually speak admiringly of both Mussolini and fascism, saying that we could only pray that a strong man like Hitler could arise in England, and champion himself also eugenics and the massive culling of the useless eaters, especially in India, where he oversaw the murder of 3 million. So this does not make Churchill a good guy in the story. It's just that he was more committed to the religion of the British Empire's dominance in the world, instead of tolerating the empire falling to a junior partner in a new world order, as some around him had wished. Some, including King Edward VIII, there featured with his wife admiringly shaking Hitler's hand. There's many pictures of them together. He was a huge admirer of Nazi Germany, including the occult underpinning religion behind that movement. And there he is with Neville Chamberlain, who had been working very hard to ensure the growth of Germany outside of its own borders, as it first went into Austria and then expanded into Czechoslovakia, followed by Poland. And all of this was made possible, as Alex Craner has incredibly proven in his recent essay series and in my interviews with him, was entirely made possible by backdoor British diplomacy, which at every step of the way ensured that the Nazis would proceed further without any condemnation of a serious way or any serious resistance, as Austria, then Czechoslovakia, with all of its gold, would fall and be given and transmitted over to the Nazi coffers, preparing the groundwork for what became World War II. And this was Neville Chamberlain's principal task. And he also, I think, was entirely committed to the idea of the Anglo-German special relationship, which also people like Montague Norman, the head of the Bank of England and the sponsor and the actual manager of Hjalmarschaft, was in charge of. He was part of the Anglo-German Friendship Association. That was Montague Norman. That's a picture also of Edward VIII bending down with a young Queen Elizabeth when she was just a little girl, teaching her the ropes of what you're going to be doing a lot in this new world order that's it's coming on for you. And in Canada, we weren't alone. There's a picture of a bunch of what are known as blue shirts. Seen in Germany, you had the brown shirts. In Italy, you had the black shirts. In Quebec, which is where the Catholic sort of dominance was, French-speaking Quebec is where you had the blue shirts. And that was one rally of the blue shirts following Adrien Arcand, the Führer of Canada, as this biography discusses of him. And he had a vast amount of support within the ultramontanist faction within the Vatican, within the Roman Catholic Church, which had their own battles between the anti-fascists of people like Pius XI, who condemned fascism, but his death made a space for Pope Pius XII to come in, who was a radically pro-fascist sponsor during that time, and who gave great space for this to grow in all of the jurisdictions where Catholicism had influence, including in Latin America. But France was also a major, saw the effects of this too, with the rise of the Pétain regime and the fascists, that also created a special welcoming party for Germany when they went in with no battle, no resistance in France. And in Quebec, it was the same thing. And the United States was not immune. You had the U.S. Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden, one of many Madison Square Garden Nazi rallies featuring about 40,000 people crowded into listening to all of these leading American Nazis from the American Bund and American Nazi Party and the American Silver Shirts speak about the glories and coherence of the Nazism and George Washington's view and vision of the new order of the ages. So you have pictures of Washington with Nazi regalia. And again, this was just one of many. This was a pretty scary movement in terms of its growing influence, and also sponsorship. Its covert sponsorship by many members of the Congress of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and also of the Senate, who had been sponsoring the growth of this thing. People like Senator Lundin. We'll maybe do a whole show on the American Fifth Columnists in greater detail. Back to Canada, on the federal level, where we have English-speaking Canada, we had fascism take on a slightly different form, a more soft Fabian form, in the form of the Fabian Society of Canada, known as the League of Social Reconstruction. And there were some of its members, founding members, who were mostly all Rhodes Scholars from Oxford. And on the right is a little stand featuring an educational program around eugenics. All right. In the midst of this this changing situation, what was happening? World War II had been put down, but this problem of eugenics was still continuing. Most of the high-level Nazis and fascists were still in play. You know, Operation Gladio was being set up. So they hadn't gone away. And many of the enemies that understood the Wall Street London support, the Swiss banking and Italian banks, the Vatican banking sponsorship of this fascist system, those who understood it within the intelligence agencies were quickly being targeted for destruction. One of the key political sponsors of the Patriots at that time was a figure by the name of Henry Wallace. That's him over there on the left, campaigning for the presidency of 1948, and there's one of his posters saying "Vote for Wallace." Now, this is an interesting thing because Wallace had formerly been the vice president under Franklin Roosevelt. Now, he also was somebody who understood the nature of this fascist beast, like I said, so well. But as soon as Roosevelt, for some reason, felt threatened that he was going to lose the fourth election, he made a deal. He accepted some deal. I don't fully understand the ins and outs of this, that allowed for one of his political enemies named Harry S. Truman to be installed as his vice presidential running mate. Apparently, there were some battles at a Democratic Party convention at the time. So you had a battle at that convention that resulted in Wallace losing out to Truman. Truman was then made by January of 1945 the vice president, putting him in as second in command. If something were to happen to Roosevelt, that he would be made president, not Wallace. Wallace was degraded to the status of Commerce Secretary, and was quickly ousted as accused of being a red commie infiltrator, along with many of his allies who had worked very closely with Franklin Roosevelt. I want to play just quickly a short little clip of Wallace speaking to the American people, just to get across the spirit of who this man was, what he represented, from the standpoint of a moral vision for the world, a healthier world that would be built up after World War II, and which was the passion of Franklin Delano Roosevelt before he died an untimely death on April 12th, 1945. So here's Henry Wallace speaking in 1942 to the American people of the vision for what type of new economic and political architecture would replace basically imperialism after World War II. Okay, so I hope everybody was able to hear that recording. But that really was the positive vision. It wasn't simply a negation, or the idea of negating empire, but rather also doing that in order to liberate here on Earth mankind to our fullest potential, to end things like artificial scarcity, the fears of secret police, as he says, of things like want, even the very fear of want itself, which was a policy, as I pointed out, of people like Winston Churchill and others. That itself was the focus of destroying, by providing a situation of the internationalization of the New Deal, what the U.S. was able to do in building up the Tennessee Valley Authority, the rural electrification projects, the massive abundance creation even before World War II had been entered. That was all the ground was set by the New Deal. The reining in of usurious banks, the breaking up of the banks themselves, the forcing of credit to abide by the will of the people and the needs of the land, instead of for the benefit of a usurious faction of gamblers and speculators who created the Great Depression. That was a very different conception. That was supposed to be the positive principle that would manifest, I think, a healthier millennialist idea, as Wallace had said, of an Augustinian concept, right, of the kingdom of God, of the idea of the city of God on earth. That would be the model around which we would acclimate our hearts and minds and our behavior were we to become a properly matured species living and walking in the divine, as is our nature, and not under the control of this oligarchy. So this was the positive thing that he was fighting for, as he was fighting for the presidency in 1948 against Truman. And he also had many allies, including this incredible figure named Paul Robeson, this American singer, baritone actor, as well as cultural ambassador, as he taught himself many languages, was able to sing to the hearts of the folk songs of people all around the world. He had freedom music that he sang enormously, and he was one of the major allies of Wallace, and a major anti-fascist, anti-imperialist, and who went on to largely launch what became the Pan-African movement. He even trained Kwame Nkrumah as a young student in America, when he was the one who set up the American African Council, which again trained a lot of the leaders of the Pan-African movement that went on to fight for independence after World War II. Were assisted greatly by Paul Robeson, inspired by him. Jomo Kenyatta also was his friend, but also the movement that Martin Luther King was to lead later on was also sparked in many ways through him. So not an insignificant figure. And he had many allies. So Paul Robeson would come to Canada, and the anti-fascist resistance in Canada was led by people like here, a member of Parliament, Fred Rose from Montreal. You had Tim Buck. You had so we had a number of these freedom fighters in Canada, who were in some cases members of Parliament, who had exposed the bankers behind Denis Arcand, the fascist eugenics programs, and who understood this very well, who had to be targeted for destruction. But then something happened after World War II, and this involved this Montreal Gazette headline of "Canada exposure of Red Fifth Column stirs the world." So a new hype, despite the fact that we had formerly been allies with Russia and China fighting fascism, despite all of that, within a very short period, they became our enemies, and we fell for it. And it was done because a coordinated, British-directed lie was put into motion. The media was complicit in promoting this a false set of stories, and as we'll discover, it was all based on provable lies, in which you could have even known back then, but people were a little bit too willing to turn off their minds and go with some tribal mob mentality. So what is being revealed here is that this Russian cipher clerk, Igor Gouzenko, who's featured on the right, he was about 26 years old, had no security clearance beyond just being allowed to be a cipher clerk, not even somebody who was deciphering ciphers in the Russian embassy, defected, and went to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in September of 1945. Again, the war had already ended in the summertime, and that's him at left for a number of years. You could only see him on TV everywhere in Canada as a guy with a Russian accent and a bag over his head, because his identity was so imperiled by the Russians, who he turned on as a Soviet defector. That's a picture of him without the bag much later on. That's again him, featuring, this is again years later, looking over some book on the fall of Stalin that he wrote. He published a number of books, got rewarded handsomely. Every speaking engagement, every interview he gave, he would get up to $1,000, which in those days was a lot of money. Still is, but really a lot of money. So he was rewarded handsomely, lived in luxury in Canada for the rest of his life. And so here's a timeline of events. On September the 7th, 1945, the Privy Council of Canada, which is what is one of the controlling nerve centers in all of Canada, passes Order 644, which extends the War Measures Act beyond the end of the war, permitting for detention incommunicado, psychological torture, and the removing of habeas corpus to all those who would be accused of espionage. So in times of war, certain rules of engagement, including with your own population, are tolerated, whereas in times of peace, that is not supposed to be the case. People are supposed to be enjoying full rights all the time, no matter what. That stopped with the extension of this War Measures Act. September 20th, 1945, Truman orders the dissolution of the OSS. So just 2 weeks later, after this happens, Harry Truman orders that the OSS, which was full of bad people, but also full of very good people who were allied with Truman and were patriots in the American intelligence community who properly assessed this fascist occult mapping. On September 5th, 1945, Igor Gouzenko leaves. So the 2 days before the Privy Council Order 644 had been passed, Igor Gouzenko, 2 days earlier, had left the Ottawa, the Russian embassy in Ottawa with documents and reports of Russian influence operations within Canada to the RCMP. So he has all of a sudden the story with apparent documents, which we'll see are very flimsy and in fact have never been seen by anyone to this very day. But he says that. That's what we were told by the media he carried out with him. And he says that there is a vast fifth column that Russia had set up in Canada, which he names a whole bunch of names. You can guess who some of these names are going to be. Continuing on with our timeline, though, just to hold this in mind, that these are not necessarily coincidental events. February 5th, 1946, the Gouzenko Espionage Royal Commission is created with the Privy Council Order 411. So it takes several months into the new year for an official royal commission to be created under Privy Council Order, and with the War Measures Act also happening at the same time. And 10 days after that, in 1946, February 15th, the first 15 targets are arrested and held for weeks in isolation in Ottawa's Rockcliffe Military Barracks. March 5th, 1946, what is that, 2 weeks later? 2.5 weeks later, Churchill's Iron Curtain speech occurs in Fulton, Missouri, telling everybody that your former allies are now your enemies and your former enemies are now your allies. Oh, and by the way, on March 5th, the same day, he also established the special relationship, the Anglo-American special relationship between British intelligence and American intelligence, and he set up the UK-USA Signals Agreement, which was based on integrating the NSA with the GCHQ as signals encryption networks of mass dragnet surveillance, and which were soon joined by Canada, New Zealand, Australia, to make up what became known as the Five Eyes. So that's all going on March 5th, very close proximity. And just to say here as a note to hold in mind that after this period of purging, this radical takeover by, I would say, the pro-fascist Fifth Column network, that was actually the Fifth Columnists. They were the ones telling us who the Fifth Columnists were. Then you had the CIA created, where there was once the OSS, with much more controlled assets and agents from the top, like Allen Dulles and his brother and others, running this thing and using very dark techniques that had never been practiced by American intelligence before. Things that had been learned by the British, and we're going to learn how that was. And finally, one thing that's noteworthy is that during this time, National Security Study 75 is produced for the NSC, by the executive secretary on British military commitments. And what this basically calls for is the idea that, well, Britain's no longer legally named an empire. However, they are a commonwealth, and they still have all of their banking and other controls of their territories. And as such, they represent a resistance to communism. And so it must be now in America's foreign policy to do everything in our power as Americans to defend British interests internationally. So that they don't, because otherwise they'll fall into communist hands, said the authors of this report. Now, in Canada, back to Canada, the lead counsel for this Royal Commission on the Guzenko Affair is named E.K. Williams. He blatantly argued for the creation of the Royal Commission, as he said in his own writings, quote, because it need not be bound by the ordinary rules of evidence if it considers it desirable to disregard them. It need not permit counsel to appear for those to be interrogated by or before it. So basically, no protections for the citizens. It's just easy to get an image, a story of somebody being guilty, and that's adequate now with total secrecy. It's a secrecy court. During the show trial, none of the defendants were allowed to see any evidence being used against them, and everyone involved, including RCMP officers, were threatened with 5 years imprisonment for speaking about the trial publicly. So nobody could speak openly about the trial. The only person who could speak and write boundlessly to the media during this period was Igor Gouzenko himself. Whenever appearing on TV in court, Gouzenko was to charge over $1,000 for some interviews and receive generous book deals and government pensions for life. Always appeared masked in a paper bag on his head, even though this cipher clerk never actually met any of the figures standing trial. His testimony against them was treated like gold. So, okay. And another little nugget here. On June 27th, 1946, the Royal Commission released its final 733-page report, which, along with the Gouzenko's own books, became the sole unquestionable gospel used and reused by journalists, politicians, and historians for the next decades as proof of this vast Russian plot. Now, before we go any further, we're going to listen to a word from today's sponsors. First, we'll start with Badlands Shop. All right, have you checked out the Badlands Shop lately? You might be surprised by what you've been missing. From thoughtful gifts and unique finds to everyday household essentials and personal care must-haves, there is truly something for everyone at the Badlands Shop. But here's what makes it different. Every single purchase you make is so much more than just buying stuff. You're investing directly into the movement, you're empowering American-first businesses, lifting up fellow Badlanders, and supporting the creators who are building this community with us. Thank you for being part of this. Your support means everything. Head over to badlandsmedia.tv/shop or click shop on the main menu at badlandsmedia.tv and discover your new favorite brands. That's badlandsmedia.tv/shop. All right. And let's have a word from Mike Lindell, too, while we're at it.
It's finally here, our second annual mega sale. This sale only comes around once a year, so take advantage of the best offers ever while you can. For example, save 50% on our Giza Dream bed sheets, as low as $29.98. And for the first time ever on TV, MyPillow mattresses and MyPillow mattress toppers, as low as $99.98. And you save 50% on our Lux Pure 6-piece towel sets. Regular $69.98, now only $39.98. And our best-selling standard MyPillows, regular $49.98, on sale for $17.98. Wait on it, mega sale, only $14.98. So go to MyPillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use this promo code to take advantage of our second annual mega sale. But wait, there's more. To make the mega sale even more special, when you order right now, your order's going to ship absolutely free.
All right. I'm assuming the last word there was going to be free. Absolutely free was likely what he was going to say. Not absolutely for $20, but free was the word. So let's get back to the show here. A lot more to go through. And actually, I'm already further on than I realized. So, okay. as I mentioned, this is to this very day used as gospel. If you ask any Canadian who does know about this, they will say absolutely. This was proof of the Kremlin fifth columnists, and thank God for the great hero Gouzenko, who has plaques and statues written about him. Now, keep in mind, when I mentioned that these documents that he took out of the Russian embassy have never been seen, literally all trial records were either destroyed or lost in the days after the commission disbanded. And if people wanted to look at the actual evidence, they would have to wait 40 years when it was finally declassified. So they were allowed to see it 40 years later. But was it actually, when people went to see it 40 years after it was declassified, what was it? We'll answer that question too soon. Let's leave that as a momentary cliffhanger. 10 of the 26 arrested were convicted and imprisoned for anywhere from 3 to 7 years. So of the 26 arrests in total, 10 were convicted and imprisoned in the secret Royal Commission court. By the way, the two justices, the two judges who presided over this court were both rewarded immediately afterwards by being anointed as Supreme Court justices of Canada. So very, very high honor, high reward for what they oversaw. But of the 10 found guilty, not one indictment or conviction for espionage was found. So no one was actually convicted for espionage. So what did they do? Those 10 people who were found guilty and went to prison were actually, though nobody knows this, they were actually, if you look at the court records, only for creating illegal Spanish passports to get Canadians into Spain to fight as volunteers and risk their lives against Franco's fascism as part of the Mackenzie Papineau battalions. That's a picture of one of the Mackenzie Papineau battalions in Spain, which is made up of, it was named after the two Republican heroes of Canada of the 1837-38 period, William Lyon Mackenzie, who ran the Republican Revolution against the British Empire in Upper Canada, today's Ontario, and Lower Canada, which was Louis-Joseph Papineau, who ran the same sister movement at the same time together against the British Empire. So that's what came of the name. And that's why these men went to prison. That's why they were found guilty and convicted, was for this. But again, if you listen to the official history books, the documentaries, what they teach in school about it, you would have to think that they went to prison because they were provably they were Russian spies. Not so. And 40 years later, in 1985, when a prestigious journalist named William A. Rubin went into the Canadian archives to finally see these declassified microfilms that had apparently been photocopied and scanned of all of the evidence, the letters and everything else, and the documents from the Russian embassy that had been scanned and uploaded, or not uploaded, but put into microfilm. There's a lot of 6 reels of microfilm. He went through all of it, and he published this article called "The Documents That Weren't There," where he writes, what is one to make up of this jumble, with no indication as to when any of the exhibits were obtained by the RCMP, how they relate to espionage, or any of the wrongdoing, and for the most part, no indication of when they were placed in evidence at the hearings. It is impossible to determine their significance, authenticity, or relationship to other evidence. So basically, he points out in this article that there were scanned phone books, there were CVs, there were shopping lists and recipes. There was no actual evidence. It was just not simply there. There was one list of that was apparently taken by Gouzenko, which was apparently, as they were told, a paper on which the Russian ambassador Zubitov had written the code names of a bunch of his Canadian assets. But there was no forensic analysis on the actual handwritten notes. It was basically like a piece of paper just like this that had been scanned into microfilm. Nobody actually carried out a forensic on the handwriting. And the Russians always denied it completely, saying that this was made up. It was fabricated by Anglo-Canadian intelligence, which is very good at carrying out counterfeiting operations. That was part of the dark arts. So again, not much there. Camp X and the birth of the CIA. Okay. Camp X plays a big role because I mentioned before that even though he came to the RCMP on September 5th, 1945, the Royal Commission itself only was launched on February 5th, 1946. So what happened in this September, October, November, December, January, and a bit 5-month period? What happened? What was going on with Gouzenko? Well, he spent that time, and this is openly recognized, this is acknowledged, at Camp X. This is in Ontario, near the U.S. border, and it was a very isolated camp that was set up in 1940, specifically in order to integrate British and American intelligence before America entered World War II, and this is what trained a whole generation of members of the OSS, the FBI, were trained in this camp, this establishment. It was set up by the British Security Cooperation, which was headed by Sir William Stevenson, a high-level Canadian-British intelligence asset, a very James Bondian type of character, very closely affiliated actually with Ian Fleming, same Ian Fleming that created James Bond 007, modeled on John Dee and the Rosicrucian intelligence operations of England of the 16th century. That was the model used again by an actual MI6 agent himself, a very high-level figure, Ian Fleming, who was again close to William Stevenson. So he created this Camp X. The BSC, the British Security Cooperation, was created in New York in 1940 in Rockefeller Plaza as a covert operation set up by British Secret Service and MI6 to interface with American intelligence. Since the USA was still neutral in the war, Camp X was used to train the Special Operations Executive as well as agents from the FBI's Division 5, that's the external international branch of the FBI, in the arts of psychological warfare, assassinations, espionage, counterintelligence, forgeries, and other forms of covert action and psychological warfare. A lot of these who went through that program were brought back when the CIA was created to create the was it called? The Psychological Warfare Division of the CIA, the Office of Policy Coordination, which was headed at different times by people like Sidney Gottlieb, the guy who helped oversee MK Ultra, James Burnham, who was a leading Trotskyist, who became the father of the neoconservatives, was also the head of the Office of Policy Coordination at the CIA. And again, these people had been put through this process of training and granted the arts of psychological warfare, pure psyops, which they then employed also to creating the Green Berets, other special forces operations that integrated and were shaped and directed by these higher level dark art intelligence sorcerers this whole time. Now, David Stafford, a fantastic researcher, produced a book called Camp X, OSS, Intrepid, and the Allies, North American Training Camp for Secret Agents. It's a great book. He writes, Stevenson vigorously opposed King's view. Now, he's not talking about the British King here. He's talking about William Lyon Mackenzie King, who was a well-intended but confused Prime Minister of Canada. He was the great-grandson of William Lyon Mackenzie, of the Republican I had mentioned, the Revolutionary of Canada of 1837, who led the attempted but aborted Republican. The only Republican uprising we ever had in Canada was led by his great-grandfather. So he had a certain admiration for his grandfather, a certain admiration also for Franklin Roosevelt and Roosevelt's dream of creating a world beyond empire. So he was, but he was also taking on very bad advice. He was a mystic, just like Wallace was also a mystic, taking very bad advice from theosophists, from spiritualists who were helping him get access to what his mother wanted him to do, who had been unfortunately long dead during seances. And that was part of his intellectual Achilles heel. So in this book, David Stafford is still talking about the more positive side of King, which William Stevenson, Intrepid, the head of Camp X, despised. He said Stevenson vigorously opposed King's view, which was the Franklin Roosevelt, the Wallace view of what the world should be. Like SIS headquarters in London, that's the British Secret Intelligence, the MI6 and MI5, the British Security Cooperation, for the most part, for most of the war, had operated a counter-espionage section to keep an eye on communist subversion. He was convinced, even before the Guzenko Affair, that BSC could provide the nucleus for a post-war intelligence organization in the Western Hemisphere. The cipher clerk's defection provided him a golden opportunity. So what he's saying is he already had the vision with Churchill to create this post-war intelligence service of an Anglo-American special connection directed by the British. And the cipher clerk Gouzenko's defection from the embassy provided him a golden opportunity to make that happen. And Churchill even later on said that were it not for the Gouzenko Affair, there would not, his speech at Fulton, Missouri would not have been possible. The Cold War would have not been possible. Now, just to say here quickly, so to recap, Camp X was created as also an assassination bureau. It took on different incarnations after the war. It ceased to exist in around 1949, 50 or so in that form, but by then it wasn't needed anymore because the job had been done. The virus had moved properly into a new host. But several incarnations of it did express themselves, like number one, a nominally civilian front group named Permindex was established by a Canadian, Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, a Major General Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, who was high up in the Anglo-Canadian Zionist apparatus. He was a major promoter. Actually, he trained with the Irgun, with the Haganah, the Jabotinsky night raiders in Israel was actually part of his training. And when upon coming back to Canada, he ascended to become a lawyer that was working for the Rhodes Scholars, the Rhodes Scholarship, to try to prevent any type of economic development between Canada and the United States, which people like William Lyon Mackenzie King, the Prime Minister, wanted to have with Roosevelt and his allies. And he headed as CEO Permindex, Permanent Industrial Exposition, again, as a nominally civilian front group that actually had at its mandate the program to assassinate high-level targets around the world, including Charles de Gaulle, who actually caught them with French intelligence that he was able to bring back into play after World War II. He was able to rein in the fascist Pétain apparatus around the Organisation de l'Armée Secrète that had wanted France to remain a forever empire with colonial holdings in East Asia, Vietnam, Algeria, and beyond. And he said, no, these people need to go free. We're entering the modern age. We cannot allow this. And so Permindex was actually discovered to have been behind at least two of the 30 assassination attempts that were made on Charles de Gaulle, who at the same time was also battling NATO and kicking NATO out of France. He was also working with the young John F. Kennedy, who was also killed by an agency that was tied directly, according to Jim Garrison, the district attorney of New Orleans, who ran the only jury trial over the conspiracy to kill John F. Kennedy. He spent decades doing this research and pulling together that Permindex and the figure of Louis Mortimer Bloomfield were at the top of the whole trademark apparatus directing this thing, and that was tied to the higher level nobility, many of the noble families, including people like Prince Bernhard himself, the founder of the Bilderberg Group and co-creator of the World Wildlife Fund for Nature with Prince Philip Mountbatten. They were directly tied to Mortimer Bloomfield. Bloomfield was himself actually the vice president of the World Wildlife Fund for Nature under the president at the time of that World Wildlife Fund, Prince Philip, the guy who said, I want to be reincarnated as a deadly virus to solve overpopulation. That same Philip. So, who was at the time president. So He was directly working with these networks. He was a co-founding member of Prince Bernhardt's 1001 Nature Trust in 1969, along with Maurice Strong and a number of other very high-level oligarchs from all over the world. So you had this thing that was tied to the murder of JFK, the murder of people like Enrico Mattei, who was working with the Italian industrialist, head of ENI. Sorry, not ENI, the Italian, the biggest Italian energy company that was working with de Gaulle, with JFK, with Pan-African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and others to provide for industrial development, high quality energy for nations that had suffered under colonialism to actually become economically free, which was not permitted. So he had to be eliminated, which happened when his plane was sabotaged. So there were a lot more. There were many other assassinations that were the product of this apparatus. Now, there's something I also want to just put out here too, because there's a slide I skipped over, but I think it's actually important just to showcase that Henry Wallace, during this time, was again being called a red commie. And unfortunately, it's so faded out. It's very annoying. I wish that it wasn't so faded out. But it's pretty much Wallace here saying, fascism in the post-war inevitably will push steadily for Anglo-Saxon imperialism and eventually for war with Russia. Already, we hear American fascists talking about, oh yeah, it's too faded out, unfortunately. It's too bad. I would have loved to have read that quote, but he's basically warning that those who sponsored fascism, the American fascists, had not gotten punished and were already preparing the seeds for World War III and had been setting up the stage for a new international fascist alliance, which he says would have an Anglo-American drive to it, which he said true American patriots need to resist now, need to organize against. And that was part of his mandate, or part of the reason why he got fired under Truman and why he ran for the presidency in 1948. So again, returning now to our current situation, we are facing, admittedly, a vast amount of propaganda. We've seen it with Russiagate. We saw all of the communist fear and the ghosts that were baked into our trauma, having suffered duck and cover. So many young people born after World War II went through their formative years in trauma, being told every day could be World War III, the death of everybody you know, because the commies want to have one world government, want to take over the world. We had John Birch Society, propaganda everywhere, sponsored by, again, the same American Liberty League, the same American fascists that had been Roosevelt's enemies, that had been the allies of Oswald Mosley in America. These same agencies went on to create things like the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the many think tanks, the Austrian school think tanks that transformed, that infused themselves into the Republican Party under the guidance of people like James Burnham and other Trotskyists, former Trotskyists, right, who always wanted a managerial revolution to get rid of the peskiness of the American Revolution of 1776 and instead create a society run only by a master class and their managers. So that was what was done. And the baby boomers suffered, right? They saw their leaders dying. They were not told why. They were given a lot of propaganda from the media. The Russians were out to get us every single day. The Chinese were out to get us every single day. The Red Scare was big. There were blacklists and what have you. And a lot of the facts about this globalist conspiracy that John Birch Society was talking about, a lot of the facts were true, except they were capturing that narrative to spin it away from British intelligence, the City of London, the occult high command behind all of that, and direct it towards those nations that actually put down the fascist project of the 1940s, that is China and Russia, who I mentioned sacrificed the most to fight and stop fascism from succeeding. So that's what became our new boogeyman. It was never resolved after the Soviet Union melted down in 1991. Nobody was given the truth about what that was all about. And so a lot of that trauma just went deeper under the surface and was always there to be reinvoked with the proper hypnotic inductions, the right messaging that could invoke the fear, invoke the felt thoughts that are currently happening, that we saw again with Russiagate, that was targeted a little bit more to clearly a left-leaning Democratic audience. But of course, you have the profiles of the conservative base that have also got their own profile and know how to be worked on as well, which we're now seeing. We've been seeing a growing amplitude of this over the recent years, that the cause of all of our problems is China. And they've got Chinese honeypots and infiltrators and fifth columnists and secret armies in Canada and the United States being trained by Biden and being trained by Justin Trudeau to be his secret armies, and they're running our drugs, and all of the drug problems are them. It's like the level and the loudness, the full spectrum power of these narratives is dizzying. And they're founded, when you start digging on them to look for proof, actual evidence of what you can hold on to, where is the actual facts that prove these claims to be true, there's never anything there. And believe me, I've tried. And actually, don't believe me. Do the exercise. Don't believe any of these accusations you're being given. Don't dismiss them, but always ask, can I prove it to be true, or is something based upon an anonymous source? You know, same kind of anonymous source that gave us weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and yellow cake, which turned out to always have been a lie, a hoax, never existed. Is it based upon the word I should take and believe of somebody in the CIA, of a patriot within British or American or Australian or Canadian intelligence? Or is that the ultimate source of some secret knowledge that only some journalist had access to? Is there anything more than that? Try it out and see where that leads you. Because again, in my experience, and my wife and I, we've even published a lot of our findings in the form of Breaking Free of Anti-China Psyops, volumes 1, volumes 2, that it's bogus, that these claims don't hold water. Now, it doesn't mean that we should dismiss the facts of the claims about the controlled organization of drugs, of fentanyl, of other things that are destroying our youth and destroying our economy. It doesn't mean we should ignore the foreign interests buying up farmland. It just means that those foreign what are the nefarious mechanisms behind the whole pandemic, right? Was it a Chinese conspiracy, a Chinese virus that was deployed by the evil Chinese Borg to just destroy our freedoms and destroy the world and their own economy for a while too? Because they just hate our freedoms, they hate our democracy, and they hate our Christianity. Is that really sufficient to explain what this was? Or is there a better explanation that takes us into the inner sanctum of those same Japanese fascists like Hiro Ishii and Unit 731 that carried out and that originated the bacteriological warfare operations during World War II, the Mengele operations in Germany, both of which, Hiro Ishii and the Mengele operations, that carried out bacteriological and experimental warfare on populations to see how to kill people using pathogens, using weaponized vectored insects to spread typhus and other things. You know, maybe it has more to do with that, because those guys got jobs by the CIA, were employed into places like Fort Detrick in Maryland, and created the entire bioweapons security complex that the Pentagon has been managing now for 80 years, that did things experimentally to civilian populations in the Korean War. Weaponized anthrax was developed out of this process. Agent Orange, that was deployed in Vietnam as well, came out of these operations. Could it be that this international network of Pentagon-run biolabs, which have total opacity, of which there's over 300 outside of the United States, have more to do with these problems of pandemics than this one particular narrative we've been given of the Wuhan lab and gain-of-function HIV-infused material into coronaviruses that was part of the Wuhan lab that just released it. So, I mean, again, there's so many more variables that would, I think, give our minds more freedom to assess a greater causation than what we are currently being given, that I think is designed more to invoke feelings of hate, of fear, of anger, and ultimately of blindness of the real enemies that actually have infiltrated and that do legitimately want to destroy our world, our freedoms, our children, and the aspirations and dreams of 1776. So I've been through a lot today. The lesson is don't believe everything you see on TV. Be very discriminating. Know how these techniques are used. Know that the same techniques that created the Cold War, the same lies, the same methodology of playing on our psychology, on our emotions, is being used still to this day. And know exactly who the enemy is, right? Because if you have a strong sense of universal history, the causal principles that shaped all of history, of which 1776 was an expression of, and which we are living in at the moment, also the battle between systems that go back to the days of ancient Athens, the battles that Plato and Socrates were waging against the high priesthoods of the temple of Apollo at Delphi, the battles that Cicero was fighting as well against the very same Sibylline oracles and oracle overlords that wanted to rule by high priesthoods, which is the origin of the modern synarchy movement of Jean-Yves Delvedre, who is also somebody who directly fed into the creation of fascism itself, right? Rule by high priesthood was the agenda of James Burnham and others who are of the Trotskyist mentality against Stalin. There's a reason why Trotsky got kicked out by patriots within Russia and why that happened. That's actually a whole story unto itself that we should just go through on one of these episodes of what is the Russian deep state and what are its origins, where is it today, where are the battle lines, because this is, again, universal history. If you have that idea of what the fight is, you're going to be much more equipped to cut through a lot of the misinformation and disinformation that we're being fed on a daily basis. I'll just ask people watching. I asked it in a written form, but I see. Somebody had written, I had asked, did anybody see the videos of Churchill and Wallace? And I was told that Churchill was shown, but Wallace was not shown. Oh, that's too bad. That's too bad. So nobody saw the 2 minutes of Wallace speaking. Oh, that's a shame. Okay, well, I'll make sure that that's a link in the description box, or maybe in the comment section. I'll put that in the comment section. So with that, I think I'll close out for today's show and look forward to seeing everybody again next Monday for another episode of Breaking Free of Psyops. Take care.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up on this video. And a special thank you to all of our advertising partners. Please remember to shift your dollars to support those businesses that support Badlands Media.